possible about the disaster, so we as a nation can begin to understand this terrible tragedy.
On the morning of the 10th of April 1968, after an overnight voyage from Littleton, the ferry Wahine encountered the worst of a violent southerly storm with winds gusting 160 kilometers per hour while entering the Wellington harbour. With passengers terrified and feeling very ill indeed, the captain and his crew attempted to get their ship back on course and out of danger. After many hours, the passengers and crew had to abandon ship and were flung out to the rough seas of the harbour in life rafts. They had to make the perilous crossing to Wellington's rocky shores, where they were met by local Wellingtonians, desperate to help. These rescuers could see the state of the harbour and understood how difficult the crossing had become. Perhaps even for those on board had realised. We are lucky enough tonight to have footage recovered of a resident in the seaside village of Eastbourne back in 1968. They were among the many heroic rescuers on that fateful day. Here's Wellington's correspondent Mason with his 1968 report.
Hello, I'm Mason and I'm reporting Khaleesi about the Wahine disaster. Tell me, how many people did you save?
I've saved over 100 people.
How many people died in the incident?
51 people died in the water.
What did you feel like when you saw people helplessly drown?
I felt horrified because I saw little kids drowning and people dying in the water.
Now back to the studio.
An interesting interview. Our thanks to Mason for sending us that old report. Those unfortunate enough to be on the Wahine on the 10th of April 1968 had to deal with a very rough night and day. Many passengers were throwing up continuously on those extremely rough seas. The passengers were all told that the storm would pass and to hold tight. Most thought it was a typical Wellington southerly storm and that the Wahine would ride it out. Unfortunately, at 6:41 a.m., the Wahine was carried onto the rocks of Barrett Reef, sustaining serious damage to the length of her hull. The starboard, that's right to us landlubbers, and the port, that's left, engine stopped working. The anchors were dropped, but it was some time before they held firm. Rescue attempts were made impossible by the raging gales and massive swells. By early afternoon, all 734 passengers and crew were ordered to abandon ship and get into the life rafts. Only 4 of the 8 life rafts could be used because of the angle of the now sinking ship. All 734 people on the ship managed to escape, but due to the stormy seas, 51 lost their lives. We can only imagine what those giant waves looked like to those people in their small life rafts, or worse, for those who had capsized. Our film technicians have found some much damaged footage of 2 survivors filmed only hours after the disaster in a civil defence shelter. We have carefully cleaned and restored the film. This is the first time it had been shown to the New Zealand public. Let's roll that footage now.
I'm Kaya. Joining me today is Rebecca and Ivy. They have experienced the worst shipwreck in New Zealand. Ivy, what did you hear at the time?
I could hear people helping other people, and lots of little kids were screaming at that time.
Rebecca, how did it feel when the ship crashed into the reef?
Well, I felt very scared and nervous that I was going to die today, but fortunately I survived.
How many people could you save?
I could save the people around me, but I couldn't save all the people in the Wahine ship.
Thank you, Ivy. Back to studio.
A fascinating piece of New Zealand history. We are so lucky to have such amazing technology that allows us to still view it. And now, let us look at human error being the possible reason for the sinking of the Wahine. Captain Hector Gordon Robertson had been master of the ill-fated ferry for some time. He had sailed her to and from Wellington numerous times in strong winds and high seas, and was an experienced captain. It was Captain Robertson's decision to enter the harbour when they did. They had arrived 20 minutes behind schedule when freak gusts of 100 knots or more struck the vessel and put him out of the line. He was quoted at that time as saying, "If those winds had struck 5 minutes later, we would have been through the entrance and could have come down the harbour. We could have come down and dropped an anchor in Oriental Bay, where it was quite calm." Some people suggested that Captain Robertson was too late in his decision to put the passengers into the life rafts. They have suggested they should have been evacuated much earlier. Captain Robertson, however, feels he made the right decision, saying, "People who say that don't know what they are talking about. If I had put them off any earlier, everyone would have been lost. I would have had 600 lives on my conscience." In a moment, we will take a closer look at the weather on that fateful day. But now, let's look at an interview given by Jennifer in 1972. This interview may give us some insight as to what was happening on the bridge that day.
Hello, my name is Jennifer, and today I have got Sione and Viliami, who are here, who was on the Wahine when it had sunk. Today I'm going to ask you a few questions. What did you feel when the ship struck the reef?
I felt scared and older people were screaming, especially the children.
What could you see when the ship struck the reef?
I could see a massive hole at the bottom of the ferry.
What could you feel when the ship struck the reef?
I could feel the vibrations.
Thank you for joining us, Sione and Viliami. Now back to the studio.
Fascinating old footage there.
Let's look at the weather on the 10th of April 1968. It certainly was
a terrible day to be stuck outside in New Zealand.
1968, when a French Caledonia with storms warnings issued throughout New Zealand. The next day, early on the 9th of April, Cyclone Giselle hit Cape Reinga. Winds of up to 160 kilometers an hour caused massive damage to buildings. Torrential rain flooded farmland in Northland, drowning hundreds of farm animals. A farmer was also killed when he was blown off a haystack. The cyclone's pattern of damage continued as it travelled across the North Island, but turned south down the east coast. Ships were driven ashore and landslips closed roads. Rain caused massive flooding and wind left roofs torn off and windows broken.
By the time Cyclone Giselle hit Wellington on the 10th morning of April, another storm had driven up the west coast of the South Island from Antarctica. The two storms met over the capital, causing huge damage. Winds in Wellington were the strongest ever recorded, at one point reaching speeds of 275 km an hour. As the storm moved on to the South Island, hundreds of Christchurch houses lost their roofs, and both the Avon and the Heathcote rivers flooded. Throughout Canterbury, over 500 hectares of forest were destroyed. In Southland, the flooding was the worst since 1913. Some people were stranded on the roofs of their houses and had to be rescued by jet boat. Cyclone Giselle finally blew out somewhere in the Southern Ocean. And there you have it, folks. Perhaps if weather forecasting could have been then what it is now, the Wahine disaster would have never happened. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Loana and Dean. What an incredible storm it must have been. Well, that's all we have time for this evening. We hope you have learnt something about your country's history and about one of our darkest days.
Please join us next week when we focus on the Springbok tour of 1981.
Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time. For the whole team at Spotlight on New Zealand, goodbye, Inohora.